For almost a year now, ICE's destruction has been on full display. Attacks on street vendors and day laborers, arresting immigrants inside of courthouses, now executions in broad daylight, the infamous alligator Alcatraz. These are images that have been seared into the American collective consciousness. And this has left a lot of people wondering, how did we get to such a place? And more importantly, how do we get out of it? By analyzing and working to understand ICE's ideological underpinnings and how it functions today, we can devise a strategy for how to deal with this abhorrent monstrosity of an agency. Now, the public is already souring on Trump's mass deportation operation, but the right wing put a lot of effort into manufacturing the consent necessary to win on a platform of xenophobia in 2024 and build authorization for the state to enact a campaign of violence against immigrants in 2025. In other words, conservatives worked diligently to create a reality characterized by anti-immigrant sentiment. And a few lies that were relentlessly repeated were key in this mission. First, Trump and Vance and basically every orbiter of the 2024 campaign repeatedly claimed that something like 20, 25, or even 30 million undocumented immigrants came in during Joe Biden's presidency. This tsunami of immigration, people like Stephen Miller would say, constitutes a threat not only to our fragile welfare systems, which immigrants incessantly abuse apparently, but will dismantle the cultural and ethnic makeup of America. According to Pew Research Center, the number of undocumented immigrants in the country, at least as of 2023, was around 14 million. That number climbed 2 to 3 million since 2021, but that's only about 10% of the number that right-wingers like to claim. It's also just not a secret how these immigrants got here or what they're doing now. Historically, the plurality of undocumented immigrants in the United States were mere visa overstays. That is, immigrants previously approved to be here that stay longer than their documents provide. More recently, a growing number of undocumented immigrants, around 40% according to Pew, had some type of deportation protection. This includes asylum applicants, DACA recipients, those with temporary protected status or TPS, victims of violent crime, migrants Border Patrol allowed into the United States, and more. Because it's the government that has issued such orders, the government necessarily knows where these people are. So this idea that there was a wave of 20 million immigrants that came in under Biden just isn't true, and of the immigrants that did come in, well, we know who they are and what they're doing. Sometimes the right wing will point to the number of border encounters under the Biden administration as evidence of the threat of immigration, such as the one that's on screen right now. This is one that Trump presented repeatedly throughout the 2024 campaign. Now, it is true that border encounters from 2021 to 2024 were higher than normal, with about 8 million encounters being recorded at the US-Mexico border during that time period. However, border encounters are not a count of how many immigrants come into and stay within the United States, but instead is a tally of the total number of individuals that Border Patrol encounters and often turns away. This number also doesn't account for the same individual attempting to come across the border and being turned away multiple different times. Needless to say, this notion that 20 million or 30 million undocumented immigrants came in under Joe Biden just isn't true. It's simply wrong. And of the ones that did come in since 2021, we tend to know what they're doing. But this narrative that there's an unstoppable wave of immigration is designed only to build fear and authorize state violence against immigrant populations, which is what we're seeing today. If this nefarious other is scary enough and threatens to unravel the social order as we know it, then the state is essentially justified in doing anything it can to repel such a threat. And from here, you can blame immigrants for basically everything. Why healthcare prices are so high, or why housing is unavailable, or why nobody can afford groceries. You can blame it all on the immigrants. Once this narrative has been established that an unstoppable tide of immigrants have invaded the country, then the answer to what are you going to do about X issue always becomes the same: mass deportations. Another narrative pushed by the right wing to intensify fear of immigrants is the narrative of quote-unquote migrant crime, specifically undocumented immigrants. Here, the right wing likes to assert that undocumented immigrants present within the country are necessarily more dangerous and violent and represent a unique kind of threat. During the 2024 election, we saw the completely baseless claim that Haitian migrants in the US under TPS were, quote, eating the cats and dogs of citizens in Springfield, Ohio. This was, of course, never true. It was so never true, in fact, that then candidate for vice president J.D. Vance said, "If I have to create stories so that American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do. Create stories," he said. Create stories. Of course, the truth of that story didn't really matter. Truth kind of just got in the way here. What did matter was that it managed to stoke fear and hatred of an already marginalized group and direct it in a politically useful way. Now, it is vitally important to note here that there is no real empirical evidence that exists to suggest that undocumented immigrants, broadly speaking, commit more crime than undocumented immigrants or even U.S. citizens. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm not going to go study by study, reading methodologies and reporting to you the results. You can do that on your own if you want. I just figured I would throw that in here because inevitably someone always comments, well, they're here undocumented and they commit more crime. It's just not true. Another example, in early 2025, the administration invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to hasten federal deportation operations against Venezuelan migrants. Tren de Aragua, officials said, had fully infiltrated the Venezuelan government. Therefore, Venezuelan migrants in the United States constitute a kind of invasion that authorizes the sweeping removal of these migrants without any court hearing or due process or any of that shenanigans. And this, of course, is exactly what happened. Venezuelan immigrants without criminal records were snatched and swept out of the country, many being sent to CICOT in El Salvador, a notoriously brutal prison. Of course, lacking criminal records, there's no way for us to know if these people did anything wrong or were actually members of Tren de Aragua, and Trump's own intelligence community said that TDA does not experience, quote, widespread organized cooperation with Maduro's government. The lie wasn't even necessarily a good one, but it authorized state crackdowns to deal with the scary quote-unquote other, so it was good enough for the Trump regime. More recently, the administration jumped at the opportunity to demonize people of Somali descent in the state of Minnesota because of some fraud schemes that came to light. After right-wing operative and YouTuber Nick Shirley conducted a phony investigation into quote-unquote Somali daycare fraud, the administration had all the pretense it needed to flood Minneapolis with thousands of ICE agents and crack down on the Somali population. Of course, it didn't matter that the Somali community in Minnesota consists of like 80,000 people, and very few of them actually committed any fraud. It didn't matter that these fraud schemes hurt the Somali community itself. It didn't matter that the leader of one of the major fraud schemes feeding our future was a white woman. It didn't matter that the vast majority of Somalis in Minnesota are U.S. citizens, either naturally born or naturalized. What mattered is that there was an opportunity to terrorize a community of color in a liberal city using federal troops, and that's what the administration did. The pretext was established, and violence followed. And make no mistake, this is an ethnic cleansing campaign, or at least the start of one. This administration wouldn't be incessantly lying about quote-unquote migrant crime and other various ethnic groups if it wasn't to, in the end, make this country whiter. The administration would not be actively trying to eliminate birthright citizenship if it wasn't to expel those they think don't have their blood in the soil. The Homeland Security Twitter account would not be posting like it's the literal reincarnation of Hitler if it was not to purposefully generate fear and resentment against racial minorities so they can expel them from the country. This is the formula that the right wing uses to invent new realities to justify ICE's reign of terror. Lie about the statistics of immigration, hyper-focus on certain segments of the immigrant population, and lie about their violence and exploitation, and then insist that the only way to solve the fabricated problem is through a state-sponsored campaign of terror and destruction. Without these invented realities, none of this would be possible. Before moving on to our next topic, I do want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, and that's you. If you enjoy this kind of content, then please subscribe to both of the channels that are connected to this video, and consider becoming a patron of Head in the Office for early access to all of our content, including the podcast, and eventually these kinds of videos as well. We're still working out the details. You might also consider becoming a subscriber of our Substack. Link to that is also in the description. It's completely free, and it's where this video was first available in written form. All that stuff is linked down below. Please, please, please support, and we're trying to grow the second channel, so a subscription would be very much appreciated. Now, the establishing of a narrative pretext necessarily leads to action, and the action of the secret police have been nothing short of devastating. In 2025 alone, 32 people died in ICE custody, making it the deadliest year for the agency in 20 years. That's basically its entire lifespan, by the way, but naturally, this has led to broad accusations of cruelty and neglect within ICE detention. Since September 2025, ICE has fatally shot at least 4 people, including Renee Nicole Good, a U.S. citizen, at the start of this year. Other than Good, according to the Marshall Project, quote, in September, Silvero Gonzalez, a father originally from Mexico who worked as a cook, was killed while reportedly trying to flee from officers in a Chicago suburb. In December, a patrol agent killed a 31-year-old Mexican citizen while trying to detain him in Rio Grande City, Texas. And on New Year's Eve, an off-duty ICE agent used his service weapon to shoot a man in Los Angeles, California, according to CBS News. Also worth considering that the vast majority of those detained by ICE currently in ICE detention have no criminal convictions. As of November 2025, 75.6% of the 65,000 plus individuals detained by ICE have no criminal history. The notion that this administration is going after only the violent criminals, or at the very least the violent criminals first, is absurd. It's not backed by data. And even the notion that there's that many quote-unquote violent criminals with an undocumented status is dubious at best. But because the regime established the narrative that immigrants are the bane of everyone's existence, undocumented or otherwise, and represent some kind of nefarious threat, ICE has functioned as secret police, disappearing people behind the anonymity of a mask. And since this administration has come into office, ICE operations have been far more brazen and destructive than I think anybody could have anticipated. ICE has conducted military-style raids on apartment buildings, snatched day laborers from Home Depot parking lots, abducted legal immigrants who publicly disagree with the government's position on Israel, and so much more. Recently, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, said ICE would be going door to door. The horrors really never stop, and it's just impossible to fully capture the disruption and destruction this mass deportation operation has caused. So, okay, the narrative pretexts are all full of holes, full of lies, just to justify state violence against these people, and ICE has been essentially destroying everything it touches. So how did we get here? How is it that ICE, an agency created in 2003, has such a presence in our communities and in our cities and is causing so much violence? In 2025, Congress passed Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which tripled ICE's funding compared to the prior fiscal year. In total, the bill provided ICE with $75 billion over 4 years to fund the hiring of new agents, deportation operations, and detentions. And I really think we're just seeing the beginning of what these ICE operations are going to look like as ICE uses more and more of the funding that Congress provided, and Trump's rotating rogues gallery of ethnic minorities brings more targets into focus. But ICE agents are not the only ones living large here. Not only are ICE agents living out their fantasies of brutalizing civilians, and not only is Stephen Miller, among others, trying to ethnically cleanse this country, but private prisons are also making a killing off of these ICE operations. According to Brennan Center, around 90% of people in ICE custody are held in for-profit prisons. Private prison companies like CoreCivic and Geo Group landed contracts with the federal government to open new detention facilities and reopen old facilities that will rake in hundreds of millions of contracted dollars. In August of 2025, CEO of CoreCivic, Damon Hinninger, told investors that Trump's budget bill was, quote, a pivotal moment for funding related to our industry. So while ICE is terrorizing our communities, locking up innocent immigrants with no criminal records, and in some cases, literally executing people in broad daylight, there's a couple of dudes that are making a ton of money. A deportation industrial complex has essentially been created here, one that will fight tooth and nail to maintain its own existence, probably by using government dollars to then lobby the government so it can get more dollars, classic lobbying shit, all while citizens and immigrants suffer the brutality of this agency. From the narrative justifications and the false pretenses and the fear-mongering comes violence against innocent people and profit for a select few. But just focusing on the political right doesn't tell the entire story here. Yes, the right wing are the perpetrators of the horrors that we've been witnessing for almost a year now, but none of this would be possible without key concessions from the Democratic Party over the course of several decades. Fascism ultimately relies on a weak opposition to thrive, and the Democratic Party has been eager to provide it. The budgets of ICE and CBP have grown consistently over the course of 2 decades, under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Tom Homan, a key figure in immigration enforcement within the Trump administration, was originally hired into the federal government by President Barack Obama. When the Biden administration was faced with allegations that he was weak on the border, he called for a bipartisan border bill that Republican Senator Lankford called, quote, the most conservative border security bill in 4 decades. When Kamala Harris was asked about immigration policy just before the 2024 election, she said,
how much of that wall did he build? I think the last number I saw is about 2%. And then when it came time for him to do a photo op, you know where he did it? In the part of the wall that President Obama built.
After ICE had begun their widespread raids in Los Angeles in 2025, 75 Democrats voted for a resolution that professed gratitude to ICE agents. And just after Renee Nicole Good's execution a little bit over a week ago, Senator Alyssa Slotkin said,
when you put law enforcement or uniformed military on the streets of American cities in this level, mistakes are going to happen. Lack of training, you're going to have a lot of new people on the streets there, and then you create a cycle of escalation that's hard to contain.
And these are just a couple of examples of the many, many, many rhetorical and policy concessions from the Democratic Party. on the issue of immigration. Democrats were not the ones to build the detention centers. They didn't provide ICE with record funding. They weren't the ones that spun the lies about Haitians eating pets and Venezuelans all being members of Tren de Aragua. But Democrats engaged in minimal resistance, both politically and rhetorically, at every step along the way, while occupying the positions of power or political influence that might have been used to prevent ICE's reign of terror before it was too late. Fundamentally, if you affirm the narrative that immigration is a thing that needs to be cracked down on, or that ICE as an agency deserves the benefit of the doubt, the side perceived as stronger is going to win the debate, and further, anti-immigrant sentiment is going to increase throughout the country, making it even harder to go back. Rather than looking like the quote-unquote adult in the room with serious solutions, you look like a weakling who's not dedicated to fixing a problem whose false premises you've affirmed with your rhetoric. I know it's counterfactual, but if we had an actual opposition party that was dedicated to making a positive case for immigration over the last 20 years consistently and principally, then it's hard to imagine that the sweeping authoritarian policies of this regime would have ever been so widely supported to begin with. So, okay, then what do we do? Do we just give up, or are there solutions to actually tackle this problem? Well, I have a couple. The first one's rhetorical, make a positive case for immigration because immigrants are actually good for this country. And the other two are sort of political or policy. And the most important policy to adopt, the most important political program to go after, is abolishing ICE. If you are not yet convinced that the solution is to abolish ICE, then allow me to briefly lay out the argument. ICE was created in 2003 in the context of national fervor around 9/11 and the War on Terror, meaning the agency is not even 25 years old. Since then, ICE's primary directive has been to terrorize immigrant populations, rip families apart, and make religious and ethnic minorities feel suspect in their own communities. And now they operate as secret police, carrying out the president's vision of ethnic cleansing proposed during the 2024 campaign, while being protected by every government official no matter what they do.
That guy's protected by absolute immunity. He was doing his job.
And this isn't a training issue. I mean, you look at a guy like Jonathan Ross, he's been trained for like 20 goddamn years and he still did this thing. It's an ideological issue with the organization. The entirety of ICE, and honestly, you can throw the entire Department of Homeland Security in there too, but that's a different discussion. But the entirety of ICE has been infected with a level of bloodthirst and disregard for human life that cannot be reformed away. As a practical matter, leaving the instruments of fascist violence intact will almost guarantee that they'll be used in the same way or worse later down the road. But abolishing ICE would end the torment of immigrant communities and certainly ease the animosity that citizens are now feeling towards their government. So as a practical matter, ICE simply has to go, just so we can avoid this kind of thing in the future. But furthermore, abolishing ICE sends a message. We will not allow federal stormtroopers to terrorize innocent people and simply get away with it. This obviously should be paired with, trials and the rule of law for leadership and the agents that engaged in this kind of behavior, but symbolically, it will show a willingness to wipe the slate clean and restart after our hopefully brief descent into fascist governance. At bottom, it is an attempt to demilitarize our immigration system. And by the way, it would be far cheaper and much less bloody for immigration enforcement to just consist of, paperwork processing and court hearings anyway. You can use that on your conservative uncle. It's an austerity argument for getting rid of ICE. But aside from the policy and political arguments, Democrats need to embrace, the truth. Immigration is good for the United States, economically, socially, culturally, and more. Immigrants, documented or otherwise, contribute to the country in innumerable ways, paying taxes and working within their communities. I just don't care that some immigrants don't have a special piece of paper that says that they're allowed to be here, and I especially don't care that they happen to be born on the other side of an arbitrary line that was drawn on a map years before any of us were ever alive. But most importantly, immigrants are people, entitled to a life of security and safety and happiness, free from the terrorism of a federal government hell-bent on ethnically cleansing a nation. If Democrats continue to concede to the right and accept any invented framing or invented story designed to instill xenophobic fear, then they're going to continue to lose, and people are going to continue to get hurt. Maybe this is all wishful thinking. Maybe I'm a fool for putting any kind of optimism or hope into a party that has so repeatedly failed us, but you can't stop a white boy from hoping. So it's time to lock in and faithfully defend the most vulnerable people in society from ICE's reign of terror. As I said earlier on in this video, the written version of this was first available on our Substack, and if you would please subscribe to both channels that are attached to this video, I would much appreciate it. Us here at Head in the Office, we're trying to grow a second channel, both so we can expand into this sort of medium form content, but also just in case the main channel ever gets nuked, you know, we want to try to protect ourselves from government censorship. So please subscribe, please become a patron if you want early access to all of our stuff, and I greatly appreciate you listening to this video. Let me know what you think. I love you.